So one of the reasons I wanted to do this, I'll get more into this in a minute, but one of the reasons I was sort of interested in this topic is, as I was doing this sort of preparation for the Hamilton talk, which I kind of decided I was going to do long before I decided to do the other stuff. As some of you may know, I did a talk on Alexander Hamilton over at the Concord Community Center, where we're putting on sort of increasing amounts of stuff. I was sort of reminded that I was talking to a friend of mine that I went to school with, sort of how much and how little we were taught about the American Revolution. It's one of those things that's kind of always in the background, and we all know sort of Lexington and Concord and the Minutemen and the Bunker Hill, and I lived in Boston for a couple of years before I came here. I went over to Bunker Hill, which was in Charlestown, which is sort of the next town over from where I lived, and I got to see. And I grew up for a while in Maryland. One of the things, if you go to grade school in Maryland, they take you around to Monticello and Fort McHenry and the whole range of colonial sites. But so one of the reasons I wanted to do this was to kind of find out some more things about the American Revolution and sort of see what I actually knew and what I didn't know. So if you're my age, and I'm not going to say what that is, one of the ways that you learned about many topics in American history is Schoolhouse Rock. And so those people who grew up in the 1970s, as I did, and their parents who were probably listening in the kitchen, can all recite the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and promote the blessings of liberty, ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution. And it's because Schoolhouse Rock would be on every Saturday, and you'd be sitting there watching cartoons, and they'd get to the end of Justice League or whatever, and there would be Schoolhouse Rock. So we all, people of my generation, got this particular thing over and over, and I'm hoping that it's going to play because I really love it.
Taxation without representation, and it's not fair. But when the colonies complained, our king said, I don't care. He even has the nerve to tax our cup of tea. To put it kindly, king, we really don't agree. Gonna show you how we feel, we're gonna dump this tea and turn this harbor into the biggest cup of tea in history. They wanted no more mothering hand. They knew the time had come for them to take command. It's very clear you're being backing, no matter what you say, we won't obey. Gonna rock revolution now, king, and we're gonna run it all away. With no more king, no more king. He's gonna do what people want. No more king, gonna run things our way. No more king, tell us what to do. Rocking our own position, splashing over the horizon. Where can it be? Looks like it's going to be a free country.
Okay. I don't want to be too critical of it because it's meant for, little kids. Little kids don't necessarily need a whole lot of historical nuance. There's some problems with this narrative, but there's some things it gets right too. The colonists, I don't think, were any necessarily more manly than poor old George III. George III, I mean, he was German anyway, as were all of the Hanoverian kings, obviously, because the wasn't working out with the local families. So North American colonies, Great Britain had started colonizing North America in the early 17th century. In 1625, there were on the order of 2,000 Europeans here. The British were by no means the first people to colonize this hemisphere. The French were moving into sort of northern parts of it at roughly the same time. The Spanish had been in South America, what's present-day Latin America, for 150 years before this. And of course, we know from the finds at Lanza Meadows that the Vikings were there a long time before that too, but this was the first real sort of population shift. Between 1625 and 1775, the population goes from 2,000 to, so 1.5 million is kind of the low guess, and 2.5 million is the high guess. Once again, they weren't doing real demographic census taking back then, so we kind of don't know, but that's a good guess. Between 1620 and 1680, roughly 287,000 slaves were imported into the colonies. Just to give you a sort of idea of the trend line, by 1860 there were about 4 million slaves in North America. The North America was part of what was called the triangular trade that went from Europe down to Africa and then to North America. A large portion of the slave population was going to the Indies rather than to North America, although North American society got more similar to what was going on in the Indies the further south that you went. As a matter of fact, I had a professor in college who said, and this was a little bit hyperbolous, but only a little bit, that one of the sort of good things for the kind of North Atlantic colonies was that they didn't make anything that anybody wanted. To a great extent, the southern colonies that grew things like tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, and then further south, the sugar plantations sugar was the sort of money product back then. The colonies got formed in a number of different ways and in a number of different times, and I'm just going to sort of go through some of the kind of generalities. There were sort of provincial or royal colonies. These were sort of bodies that were governed by a commission at the pleasure of the king. There were proprietary colonies, and the one I'm most familiar with, I grew up for a while in Maryland, and if you do grow up in Maryland, you learn a lot about the Calvert family, the Baltimores. They were the ones who originally colonized Maryland, and there's a reason why Maryland is one of the most predominantly Catholic states in the United States, and it's because the Baltimores were Catholics. And it's so one of the things that you can sort of see in early colonization is the effects of the Reformation. A lot of what goes on in North America has its roots in Europe, although sometimes the things move the other direction, as in the case of the 7 Years' War. One of the big driving factors of this is the Reformation that started in the 16th century. England becomes Protestant during the reign of Henry VIII, and you kind of see the kind of movements of people out of England who are not in soul with that particular way of doing things. So, for instance, the Pilgrims were religious fundamentalists, not to put too fine a point on it, who were more sort of fundamentalist than the Church of England, thought the Church of England was too much like Catholicism, were often persecuted in Great Britain, in the British homeland, because they were seen as dangerous to the established church. The Church of England, for those of you who don't know, is sort of like the Catholic Church, but with the King of England, or the Queen of England, as the case may be, taking on the role that the Pope would have. And this is basically a sort of innovation of Henry VIII that he sort of came up with to get himself out of his marital problems. Okay, I'm going to tell you this. I'm sorry, I know this is far field, but one of the really interesting things that happens in Europe is that starting in the 16th century, the Bible gets translated into vernacular languages like German and English, French. Before that, it had been in Latin, and a lot of times even the priest didn't know what it meant. So what happens in the 17th century, especially 16th and 17th centuries, people start reading the Bible and actually figuring out what's actually in there. And this causes a lot of problems because Catholicism is a very top-down sort of institution, and so is the Church of England. Henry, his problem really was with like the Pope, not with the sort of structure of the church per se. So that you get these movements of people saying, there's a really great book by Christopher Hill about the English Revolution, which is about the kind of, in part about the religious movements that broke out in England in the 17th century. And it's a lot of people, the Quakers were famous for this. A guy would be up in the front of the church giving a sort of sermon, and Quakers would stand up and say, no, that's not what the text means, it means this, which was very upsetting to people. So anyway, the Pilgrims were a kind of persecuted religious minority who wanted to get to a place where they could worship in the way that they wanted to. And the same way with the Calvert family, the Baltimores, who went to Maryland. They were Catholics. Catholics were also very seriously persecuted, and they wanted a place where they could be openly Catholic. What's true of all of these colonies, what's true of all of the American colonies, is that they were all acknowledged as such. So the authority, the way authority, political authority was established for them was the king and then some other bodies, and then that's it, right? So, and this is going to come up later. We all know the whole no taxation without representation thing, which is slightly more complicated than it's presented, but also was a big thing. So, the predominant economic theory in those days was what's called mercantilism or mercantilism, and the theory of mercantilism is that the economy exists to promote the state, and not vice versa. If you were going to trade, if you were going to import goods into England, you had to get a license to do so, and there were only a small number of places where you were allowed to do it. Same way if you were going to go and sell cloth on the European continent. England was a big producer of woolen goods at that point. They would take them over to the Low Countries. There were a small number of places where they could do it. In the earlier forms of mercantilism, a lot of times what would happen is you would have to take your stock, go and sell it to the local authorities, and then they would sell it. But so the theory, there's a kind of idea that runs around that the free market is some sort of natural idea, and it's not necessarily, and this is not to say that the free market is not a good thing, it's not to say it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's one kind of institution, and plenty of other institutions, but the actual unfettered free market is a relatively novel institution. I mean, it's really only 250 or so, 300 years old. Before that, and in this particular case, it was very much the case that the government really got to say what kind of economic activity could go on. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the Middle Ages will know that there were these fairs that they would set up, and they would happen for a couple of weeks, during the year, and then that would be it. Like, you're not allowed to do certain kinds of economic operations outside of them. So, but anyway, everybody who went over there knew that they were going to a place that wasn't England, that wasn't Great Britain. And this was a draw for a lot of people, right? Because what you wanted to do, what a lot of these people wanted to do was worship in their own way. A lot of them wanted to be in a place where you could actually move in society. There wasn't what you'd call a lot of social mobility in Great Britain or in any European society at that point. If you came from the lower orders, chances are that's where you were going to stay. In France, I mean, it was by law. Like, you really, if you came from some village in Shropshire or whatever, you weren't, that's what you were going to be. Like, there was no, go make your fortune or whatever. I mean, there could, people did it, but not very much and not very often. So a lot of the motivation for getting over to the New World was to try and find a place where you could get a new start. There's land here. And one of the big problems that goes on is that the English authorities at a certain point said, well, we don't want people spreading out too far because it's hard to keep track of them, it's hard to tax them. And also, we're not the only people here. There are the French who are up in Canada, and there are the Spanish down in Florida, and in the French were also in the Caribbean islands, and the Spanish further south, the Portuguese as well. And there are also the native people. And the native people are at times friendly, but also relatively not friendly about the idea of people just randomly moving into their land. And there was a lot of tension that arose between settlers pushing westward beyond the Appalachians and the native people. And there was a lot of violence that went on between the two groups, and some very brutal events on both sides. I mean, both sides were really, there was no good guys necessarily. The Indians had a legitimate beef. Like, really, they were as far as you wanted to say, the legal owners. Although this brings up an interesting point in kind of British legal theory, which we'll get to in a minute. And it gives the kind of colonial governors fits, because what they want to do is for people to sort of stay where they're supposed to be so they can be taxed and they can have a kind of proper order. So these are the 13 colonies, and you can kind of see, this is 1755, I think, when you can see the sort of eastern seaboard colonies. This tells you a little bit more. So this is the British colonies. These are the kind of zones of conflict. The French, who've claimed this territory, there's a kind of competition going on between the French and the British up. So another thing that I forgot to mention that comes out of this area is furs, and that's what's being sort of, that's why people are interested in this stuff up here. It's not great for farming, but it is great for trapping. And then further west you get the Spanish. This is sort of after 1748. And then you see Jamaica, the Bahamas, you see Cuba and the island of Santo Domingo. The western part is owned by the Spanish, and the eastern part is owned by the Spanish. The western part, which became Haiti, is owned by the French. And really, ironically, the Caribbeans are the real money area for the reason that I stated earlier. The sugar, there's a lot of books you can read about this. I recommend, if you're interested in the history of the Western Hemisphere sugar, learning about the history of the sugar trade is really fascinating. It was incredibly brutal. The climate there was not good for anybody. Slaves there tended to die off at an incredibly fast rate, so they would have to bring more over from Africa. So that's why the slave population grew quickly down here, and then in here, where similarly tropical-esque crops could be grown, more tobacco and cotton rather than sugar, which has to have a sort of warmer, more tropical climate. Things start to get real around the end of the 1730s. There's a lot of conflict going on between the colonial powers, and there's also a lot of conflict going on in Europe at this time between the French, the British, the Prussians, the Spanish. Things kind of start to kick off in 1739 with what's referred to now in English as the War of Jenkins' Ear. The Spanish call it the Guerra del Asiento. And the Asiento was the contract that gave British slavers permission to sell slaves in the Spanish part of America. And so there was a lot of smuggling that went on. And at one point, in 1739, in 1731, a British ship had been boarded by a Spanish coastal guardian ship, which was in fact a privateer. This is back in the day when there was sort of navies and kind of navy adjacent people. If you could fit out a ship, you were in a lot of cases welcome to kind of fill in the holes, and if you made a few bucks on the side. So a lot of times, this is kind of a funny thing about watching Pirates of the Caribbean, because there were a lot of people who were sort of on both sides at different times. Sometimes we're working for the government, sometimes we're pirates. Anyway, so in the course of the conflict that happens on this ship, the Spanish captain is supposed to have chopped off the British captain's ear. Some people had it that he chopped off somebody else's ear. It was later sort of, the story was told that the ear was brought to Parliament. This was not true. But it was a serious heightening of the tensions between the Spanish and the British. At the same time, the British and the French were coming into much more serious conflict because they were much of the same territories. In the first instance, in the sort of trapping areas up in the sort of northern areas of what is now Canada, but also in the Trans-Appalachian area. The war that eventually breaks out, the conflict really starts here and then spreads to Europe. There's a very serious sort of great power rivalry that goes on. And so later on, you'll find yourself maybe asking, why is it that the King of Spain or the King of France, who's as absolutist as they get, wants to send a navy and a bunch of troops over to help out a bunch of raving radicals? And it's for this reason. The view of the French monarchy is that anything that weakens the English is a good thing. And it's worth remembering too that by about the 1760s or early 1770s, North America and the Indies are producing about 40% of the GDP of the British Empire. So this is a pretty serious plum that people are pursuing here. The native people the French managed to get the sort of native people to side with them. And the reason was not sort of hard to kind of figure out, in the sense that the native people saw the English settlers, the British settlers, as encroaching on their land. So whereas the French weren't moving large amounts of population mostly around. I mean, they founded Quebec. But by and large, what the French wanted to do was send people out into the hinterland to trap furs, which mostly the native people were okay with, right? Because it didn't involve like chopping down the woods, planting fields, taking over, what have you. The 7 Years' War, as it came to be, as the European part of it, is really in a lot of ways the First World War. I mean, it takes place in a wide variety of different places and involves most of the major European, all of the major European powers. Ultimately, there's what's called the diplomatic revolution, where there's a lot of side switching, which I won't go into. The 7 Years' War could sort of be the subject of a lecture all its own. Ultimately, the British come out on top, especially in sort of colonial area, because they just have better access to it. They have more people there. William Pitt, the elder, the British Prime Minister, decides to fight this war in North America is that he says, well, we're going to bankroll it. So we're going to spend whatever it takes, roughly, to win this war. But we're not, the British have never been, and we're not at this time certainly, one of the bigger land powers. So this is the diplomatic revolution. So what you get is the French, the Austrians, and the Russians on one side, and the English, the British, the Prussians, and the Hanoverians and other. You can kind of, I wish I had a bigger version of this map, because what you can kind of see is, this is Germany. Like, Germany is a geographical designation at that point rather than a country. Like, Germany is a collection of about 150 larger and smaller states, of which the really big player is Prussia, probably the most formidable land military power in Europe at this point. Somebody once said that Prussia was like a military camp with a state attached to it. It was also, the theory of Prussian officering was that the men should fear their officers more than they should fear the enemy. And the discipline in the Prussian army was so severe that at a certain point, the Austrians, this is at a little later point, set up receiving stations along the Silesian border to take all the people who wanted to desert from the Prussian army. But the English managed, with their allies, force the French into a sort of capitulation, which gets signed at Paris in 1763, the Treaty of Paris, and in which the English get a large swath of territory in Trans-Appalachia, the Ohio Valley. I mean, we could all be speaking French. Ironically enough, this is a useless fact, but I'm going to tell you anyway. French was the sort of language of all the aristocratic houses. So in Prussia, if you went to the Hohenzollern, the Hohenzollerns were the ruling family of Prussia. Their castle in Potsdam was called Sans Souci, which means without care in French. If you went to Sans Souci, you would hear people speaking French, not German. German was viewed as kind of low. I mean, it was a little odd that the George I, George II, George III, all were German speakers. I think George I never really learned English, because they're from the Principality of Hanover out in the western part of Germany, and they probably would have been educated to speak French too. The French, as kind of like lingua franca, if you will, died out in England a lot earlier, I think partly because of the rivalry. What you can see here is, this is the sort of original 13 colonies. This is what's called the Indian Reserve of 1763. Once again, the idea is we're kind of limit Western movement. This area here progressively becomes more and more settled by British people. Also, lots of other people. I mean, you'll sometimes hear it said that the official language of the United States was almost German. It's not quite true, although there were a lot of German speakers. Germans came to North America, especially to Pennsylvania, for roughly the same reasons. There was not a great deal of social mobility, and maybe you indenture yourself for a while, anywhere up to 10 years. But then, in the end of it, you have some money, you can get yourself a farm, and you can actually, live a life that you want to live. the sort of Trans-Mississippi area is ceded to the Spanish, although the French, this is a temporary condition. And here things get complicated. One of the effects of the French and Indian War was to really begin the formation of a kind of American identity, because you had guys who'd never been 5 miles from their home farm, all of a sudden having to get up and go and fight in these kind of far-flung places. George Washington, who was not, some like hayseed from the sticks or whatever, but was from the sort of like local squirearchy, if you will, actually plays a sort of precipitating role. He's involved in this attack out in the kind of boonies on a French fort. By the way, if the British had just offered him a commission, things might have turned out a lot different, but that's for another time. But what you get is the beginning of a kind of formation of a sort of American identity. But also you get this sort of feeling, so the British after the war say, well, look, we paid a lot of money for this, right? We sent ships, we sent some soldiers, not a gigantic amount, but but it cost a lot of. This is the thing about war. People think, you go lightly into it, but war is fabulously expensive. Now, in this case, the sort of prize for the war is also a real cash cow, or a lot of it is. But so the British government says, well, so we're going to impose these taxes on you to kind of recoup some of this large amount of money that we just paid out to keep you from being overrun by the French and the native people. People in North America, they're used to a kind of limitation on trade. There had been since the 1650s what we call the Navigation Act. And that meant that colonies, there's a whole series of them, but a part of the sort of implication of them is that colonies can't trade with each other. So the West Indian trade couldn't go north to Boston. It had to go to England. So it all has to go to the English metropole. And this is part of mercantilism as a theory. What at first you start to see is a kind of series of taxes on excise taxes or tariffs, basically, on sugar. Once again, sugar is, imagine you couldn't just go to the supermarket and see a whole aisle of about 20 different kinds of sugar. And also imagine that you didn't get sugar in everything that you ate. We get a lot more sugar in our diet than they did in those times. So sugar was a kind of a big, it was a big deal. And this starts to cause some annoyance. And then they move in 1765 with the Stamp Act. And that's a whole other level. And the reason is because that's the first tax that's internal. It's not, thing crosses a border into the colonies and you have to pay, right? This is anytime you publish a document or make a newspaper or, have your will done, you have to have a stamp. And you have to pay money for that. And that was very upsetting. And why? In fact, the level of taxation on colonists in North America was very low comparatively, certainly very low compared to people in Great Britain, but also very low compared to people in Europe generally. But it's this idea, no taxation without representation. That's not fair. I learned that much if I learned nothing else. That line has power, right? I say it to you, and you probably, I'm sure you think to yourself, yeah, that's exactly, taxation with representation isn't that great. But taxation with no recourse, where you have no remedy, is particularly galling, even if it's not that much. Because for a couple of reasons. One is it just sort of strikes at our basic notions of fairness, or what they like to call the rights of Englishmen. Now, this is an interesting thing about England. There's what they call the English Constitution, but it's not like a written document. There's a sort of body of law that's been kind of negotiated and built up over centuries. And a lot of British legal theory is basically just sort of commentaries on. So when Henry VIII wanted to do wanted to get rid of Catherine of Aragon, he first sent his scholars into the library trying to find all the sort of edicts about this and that to try and find if there was any way out legally that he could do, because divorce was just not a happening thing. eventually you get, once again, the Tea Act. This is notorious because of the Boston Tea Party, when a bunch of yahoos dressed up like Indians. I don't think they dress very, you'll see some of these things where they're like all painted up and whatever. I think they mostly like put on Indian blankets and just went onto the ships and dumped the tea into the harbor. But so what's brewing here is a kind of a conflict between the people in North America who feel put out by having to pay taxes without having members of parliament, and the British government who say, well, okay, number one, we paid all this money. Number two, you're living in colonies. You're not living in the part in the... So, and also, let's just be clear, the king is the king. So what he says goes, right? And you just have to put up with it. This gets into what I mean to kind of be the kind of second half of this talk. And it's what you might call the intellectual origin. So the degree that I got was as an intellectual historian because I'm really interested in the way that ideas influence people. And it turns out that this is one of the most idea-driven events in European history. So the English are a parliamentary monarchy. But at this point, I mean, it's very different than the parliamentary monarchy today because at that point, the king still had a great deal of power. It had been reined in, particularly since he was forced to sign the Magna Carta by the barons. He was, the English kings, after they signed the Magna Carta, every new English king would have to kind of say, yes, I think the Magna Carta is a great thing, and then they would proceed to ignore it. What goes on over the course of the period between about the 13th, 14th century and the modern era in England is a kind of progressive limitation of royal power and a sort of shift of that power into the parliament. So there's an important part of this background that rests in the English Civil War, the mid-17th century, the third decade of the 17th century. But they also, if you look at, there's a really great book, and I meant to bring it with me and just left it upstairs. But there's a great book by Bernard Bailyn called "The Intellectual Origins of the American Revolution," in which he points out that so what happened was this is a very literate culture. The rate of literacy in the North American colonies approaches in many places 70%, which is a lot. France, it was something like, I don't think it ever cracked 40% until more modern educational methods, etc. But so you get people in the who are upset about these things. You get a very extensive debate going on in these pamphlets. These little things that can be from about 5 to about 80 pages, sometimes more. They can be printed quickly. They can be distributed very quickly. This is once again a literate culture. People are used to reading things. And you get a lot of people on both sides. So there are a lot of sort of people arguing for the king's prerogatives, especially in New York. New York was a notoriously loyalist city, ironically enough.
Stamp tax?
Well, yeah. Well, because, I mean, a lot of them thought we get a lot of benefits from the British Empire. And there was a very extensive debate on that topic. And what you see, the point Bailyn makes, I think this is really great, is if you read these pamphlets, Bailyn did one collection, and Gordon Wood did another of pamphlets from this debate. We have copies of them upstairs. What you see is a lot of references to Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and various other, Blackstone, all these thinkers. But a lot of times, or most of the time, they're really kind of just cherry picking. So if you come up in kind of scholarship and you're doing kind of what we call exegetical writing, that is, say, writing about, like, explaining another text, you're sort of obliged to kind of read the whole thing, find out what it means, and then, you can pull quotes out of it that are sort of consonant with the meaning. You don't want to just sort of cherry pick quotes, because then you can pull out something that, if you just look at one line of something, you might not get the real meaning. So they did tend to cherry pick a lot. So the way to understand the intellectual origins of what these people are doing is not to kind of look at, we don't necessarily need to do a kind of deep dive into these big name thinkers. This is Montesquieu, that's Rousseau. I mean, Rousseau, that's John Locke, about who we'll talk about a little later. Rousseau is this very famous Enlightenment thinker who starts out his Origins of Inequality by saying, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. And this is a pretty electric thing to say in the middle of the 18th century. I mean, this is the kind of thing that can get you killed. It's not okay to be sort of criticizing the bases of authority, and especially in England, where in the 17th century there had been this very intense series of events that had resulted in the king getting his head chopped off, Charles I, that is to say, an intense questioning of the sources of political order. So this is, you'll see these English authors, Thomas Hobbes, Robert Filmer. Hobbes basically says, man is a wolf to man. What we need is these political institutions where people concede their freedom so that the king and the government will prevent people from coming around and killing you and taking your stuff. Which in the 17th century was the kind of thing that you worried about because it happened a lot. When political order breaks down, the only worse thing than a bad political order is anarchy. For the reason that, and Hobbes makes this point, you get a bunch of guys together, it doesn't matter how strong the one person you're going after is. Like if I have 10 guys, like we're going to take your stuff and do whatever else we want to do. There are these threads within the British sort of mentality that emerge from the colonists, and I want to talk about a couple of them. In the 17th century, you get the English Civil War, which is a revolt by members of it was some members of the highest aristocracy, but it was mostly kind of people in the squirearchy led by Oliver Cromwell and his deputy and son-in-law Henry Arton. And their idea was, we are sort of representatives of the living God. We don't recognize the temporal authority of the king. We only recognize biblical authority. And the people should rule. And they form what's called the New Model Army. New Model is the sort of Britishism for newfangled. And it's an army where, officers are elected, but it's also an army, that doesn't just exist as a kind of professional body or whatever. It's an army that's meant to be an expression of the will of God. While this happens, in Britain at the time, there's also an emergence of a number of political and religious movements. The Levelers are the ones that are most well known, but there were also other groups, the Diggers, the Fifth Monarchists. These are people who have read the Bible. People read the Bible incredibly closely because this is the first time they've had a chance to do it. And that, they come out and say, well, look, it doesn't really say that there should be kings necessarily. It may say that you give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but it doesn't really say why one man should intrinsically be over another man. And the Levelers take this to a real sort of extreme. And there's a moment in there's the kind of first Civil War that ends in 1645, and then it breaks out again. But the Levelers in the New Model Army start agitating. They elect what are called agitators, which really they mean agents. And they go to the leadership of the New Model Army. They go to Cromwell and Arton. And they say, look, you guys talk about how the people should be running things. We think so too. And we think you should, they were having these negotiations with the king. Why are you doing that? We think that, we're taking you right at your word. And you can kind of see, there's a moment, an event called the Putney Debates from October to November 1647, held at Putney Church. There's a full transcript from it, and you can kind of see the sort of Cromwell and his Arton kind of face palming every time they say these things, because what they're saying is, look, sure, we said the people should run. We didn't mean you people. We didn't mean just sort of every joker running around the street. We meant Cromwell is a member of the East Anglian squirearchy. He's a local notable. He thinks that people like him should be running things on God's premises. Right? God doesn't say anything about, the Bible doesn't say anything about establishing some sort of church hierarchy as far as they're concerned. Now, Catholics read the text differently, and there's a lot of argument about it. Levelers are, the Leveler faction in the army is represented by a guy named Thomas Rainsborough, a very charismatic guy. And at one point in the debate he says, and I think this is one of the most powerful utterances in the political theory of the English language, for really I think that the poorest he that is in England hath the life to live as the greatest he. And therefore truly, sir, I think it is clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government, that he hath not had a voice to put himself under. And I am confident that when I have heard the reasons against it, Something will be said to answer those reasons, insomuch that I should doubt whether he was an Englishman or no, that should doubt of these things. So what is he saying here? Even the poorest man in the country has a life to live in the same way that a rich man does, and his life is of the same value, and he cannot be compelled to serve a government that he has not given his assent to. You can see the faces hitting the palms. No, no, no. This is not what we meant. Ayrton says a little later in the debate, no man hath a right to an interest or share in the disposing of the affairs of the kingdom that hath not a permanent fixed interest in the kingdom. What does he mean? Unless you own property, you don't really have an interest in the kingdom. You might vote for anything. You might vote to, to expropriate everybody's money. So the debate a little bit peters out, but this idea, and the ideas sort of put forth by the levelers, wend their way through the kind of English culture and are in a lot of respects, I think, important in understanding the way people think about their liberty later on. And the Ayrton position is also represented. So you notice that when it comes around to have voting in North America, it's not universal manhood suffrage. Certainly it's not women voting, let's just be clear. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But by their lights, there certainly was. I mean, it's a very alarming prospect to a man of the 18th century that and partly it's because women are not free. Women are technically the possession of their husband. So why would you be able to vote? You just be, it'd be like letting your horse vote. And I say this not because I agree with this ridiculous idea, but that's the way they thought about it, right? But also, you don't just want some grubby fella in the street casting a vote either, because what stake does he have? And mostly, in the United States, once again, for the colonial assemblies that happened in the 1770s, you have to have property in order to vote, because that's what's viewed as giving you a stake in society. But I love this Rainsborough quote. I mean, it's the thing, because it's one of those things that once again, really, the degree to which it's sort of built into our way of thinking is visible. When you just hear it, you think, yeah, that's really right. Like, everybody has and that's a very Christian principle. Like, the sort of fundamental, in a way, or one of the fundamental defining qualities of, or premises of Protestantism is everyone is equally proximate to God. So if you don't need to have these institutions that kind of tell you how you should relate to God, because it's about you and your soul and your salvation, right? And you are the one who has to make these decisions. And every time I read this Rainsborough thing, I get a little choked up, because I think it's, that's what he was saying is a really revolutionary thing to be saying in 1647. But it's one of those things, it's an idea that's kind of won out for us. John Wilkes, I mentioned him because he becomes kind of a cause célèbre for the people in the colonies. He's born in London. His father is a brewer, I think. In 1747, at the age of 21, he marries into a family from whom he gets an estate and what they call a living. That is to say, he gets a certain amount of money every year. He's elected to Parliament in 1754. He becomes convinced that the government, Pitt's government, and then subsequently Lord Bute's government, are kind of giving away the show in terms of the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris. And he starts this paper called the North Briton. He did this because Lord Bute was a Scot. Lord Bute succeeded Pitt. Publishes a lot of scurrilous things. I'll say a couple of things about John Wilkes. He was notorious for being one of the ugliest men in the kingdom, yet he was also notorious for being a real rake. He once said that it takes me about an hour to talk my way past my face. He had a long-running beef with John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich. John Montagu apparently, there's some dispute about whether this actually happened, although there was people who claimed to be eyewitnesses to it. Montagu at one point in a fit of annoyance said to John Wilkes, "Sir, you will either die on the gallows or of the pox." And Wilkes said to him, "Sir, that depends on whether I embrace your principles or your mistress." So with that kind of mouth on him, it's not surprised that he was eventually declared an outlaw. He published things that were so scurrilous about the government that the king became personally offended. And he was in prison for 2 years. Then he became Lord Mayor of London in 1774. Going to prison, if you were sort of from the upper crust in those days, was really not the kind of thing that was a bar to sort of future advancement in politics. He was a very vocal critic of the king, and his case was taken up. If you read the pamphlets that get published in the 1760s and early 1770s in North America, they're very fascinated by John Wilkes's case. I'm just going to say something quickly about John Locke. John Locke, we saw his picture earlier. He wrote 2 treatises of civil government. The first was about sort of like the role of the nature of the father in political theory. But the second was about kind of individual rights and property rights. And Locke was a sort of very prominent defender of the idea that people have a right to their property. They have a right to dissolve a government that is not protecting them and their property. They also have the right, and this is an interesting thing, if you have property, but you are not exploiting it to its fullest, whatever, that property can be taken from you. And the people he means about this are native peoples. So the native people aren't using the land in the optimal way that God means them to. So it's legitimate for us to come and take it. I got in a big argument one time with my roommate when I was in library school we had another roommate who was Japanese, and he was effusing about the brilliance of the American system, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but he said, your property is protected. And I said, yeah, unless the government makes an eminent domain claim, decides that building a shopping mall where your house is would be much better for things. So we like to think of property as kind of sacrosanct, but only to a certain degree. And finally, we get to Thomas Paine and his very famous Common Sense pamphlet published in 1770, written in 1775, but published in 1776. No piece of political writing is more important for the formation of revolutionary culture. I mean, so let's be clear about what's going on here. The agitation that starts going on in 1773, 4, 5 is mostly along the lines of, there are these problems, let's fix the problems. But we're all Englishmen. We all have the rights of Englishmen. We all accept that the king is the king, or most of us do. But there's a process of radicalization going on, and it's important to note that this is the case, because within the space of a couple of years, all of a sudden you get to the point that people are willing to take up arms and try and overthrow the government. And people say some dumb things about it in popular culture now. But just think about what it would take for you to join a militia and go out and try and overthrow the government. I mean, think seriously about this question, because it's not, you might just sort of think, haha, whatever. But that's a pretty serious step, because it means, if you get it wrong, chances are you're going to do a serious stretch, or you're going to be executed. You're going to lose all your property. Your family's going to be completely ruined. This is a big thing. This is a big change that goes on. And Paine's, part of what goes on is the British trying increasingly heavy-handedly to enforce the collection of these various taxes. But also what goes on is people reading writings like Paine's Common Sense. I mean, one of the sort of interesting things is the American pamphleteers they're not literary in the way that the British pamphleteers are. There isn't a single one of them who is a writer of the quality of Jonathan Swift, for instance, who wrote a lot of pamphlets on other things. Now, okay, that's a high bar. Jonathan Swift is probably one of the 4 or 5 greatest prose stylists of the English language. But what they lack in kind of literary style, they have in this very direct way of phrasing themselves, and this is Paine to a T. What Paine basically says is, look, the monarchy was great, but we've advanced beyond that. And you can think back to that Schoolhouse Rock thing. Like, now we're ready to run it on our own premises. The monarchy was okay, but it doesn't work for us here, and it doesn't work for us now. So if we want to look at the specifics of our situation here in the colonies, what we need is a representative organization so that we can run our affairs in a way that's relevant to us, so that we can preserve this kind of state of equality. Once again, there's this idea that comes up through the levelers, it comes up through a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau particularly. Rousseau thinks, back up for a minute, Hobbes, the state of nature. Life is solitary.
Nasty, brutish, and short.
There's another adjective in there too, but yeah, nasty, brutish, and short is the one that people remember. So we have to have institutions that keep us from killing each other and taking each other's stuff. Rousseau has just a reverse idea. In the state of nature, everything was really great. Human beings were really awesome. And it's just society that messes us up and gives us all these messed up ideas. Paine goes sort of to the second idea, in the sense that he's interested in this kind of fundamental equality of people that doesn't track very well with the kind of monarchistic, aristocratic system of the way that exists in Great Britain, that exists in England. And for him, there's a sort of natural law premise here. The distinction between kings and people is unnatural. There's no reason in nature why the king should have power. It's just something that it was an institution that was created. But we can create other institutions, and this is what he wants to do. I'm just going to show you this. Somebody made a flow chart of his structure for the colonial government, which we won't go through bit by bit, except to say that actually it's a little less complicated than it looks, and it's certainly less complicated than the system we have now. Through the agency of people like Paine, channeling, if you will, these sort of English ideas of freedom and equality, what you get is people ready to go out and take a stand against what they perceive as, what they I think quite legitimately perceive as, the injustice of the English system that basically uses the colonies as a kind of cash cow, but doesn't give them an effective say in the way that the colonies are going to be run. Tensions rise pretty dramatically in the course of 1775, and it's really in 1776 that things break out into open violence. And at the beginning, things don't look really very good for the colonists, for the rebels. In the next lecture, you'll see, when you read the sort of military history of the Revolutionary War, you will be amazed that we actually won this thing. The British were not a great land power once again, but they had a very well organized army, and they had a lot of guns. And it was really, to a great extent, partly it was the distance, and partly it was some bad generaling on their part, and partly it was the French, who thought to themselves, Louis thought to himself, this is great, I'm just going to poke King in the eye, thanks for taking all our land in North America. But what you get here is the sort of precursor state for this really fascinating experiment in political organization of the kind that's never really been seen before. During the period, the Protectorate in England, when Cromwell was in charge, and for a few years afterward, you had a kind of aristocratic democracy, if you will. But this is going to be the first experiment in really, we're going to have popular government without an aristocracy. People who are rich are still also going to be powerful. And you can kind of see, we'll see as we sort of go on, the increasing worry about this idea that people who are rich are engaging in some sort of machinations. One of the things that Hamilton is frequently accused of, Jefferson set up a whole newspaper to have a kind of scurrilous journalist accuse Hamilton of being a crypto-monarchist. But this is a state being run on a fundamentally different premise than any of the other European states, with the possible exception of a few Swiss city-states, but there's only not that many people in them. So this is the first real experiment that takes place in mass democracy in the kind of European Atlantic zone. And in the next talk, we'll get into how it was that 13 colonies who, in a lot of respects, didn't have a lot in common with each other, managed to get it together and achieve independence from one of the preeminent military powers in Europe at that time. So, thank you so much for coming out, and I will see you.